Hello, and welcome to the Inside Knowledge podcast for people with IBS. This is episode 112, and I am Anna Mapson. I'm a registered nutritional therapist and I work with people who've got IBS and SIBO. And today's episode is going to be sharing with you 3 new research papers that have been published in the last 6 months, I think. They are all different topics, but hopefully something in there that will interest you no matter what your kind of symptoms. I did an episode like this before, which was episode 71, and it was really popular. And actually, I think I'm going to do this more often because I really like learning new things that have been published and really keeping my research knowledge up to date for digestive health. And I thought I would share some of these things that might be a little bit more actionable or clarifying things that we haven't known before. So the different topics I want to talk about today is one about SIBO, particularly hydrogen sulphide SIBO, and how the breath test relates to the microbiome in the small intestine. So this is really interesting. The second one I want to cover is about specific probiotic strains that have been covered for subtypes of IBS. Now, this is really key because a lot of probiotics are tested across IBS and they don't specify whether it's constipation or diarrhea. But this was a systematic review and a meta-analysis of other randomized controlled studies. So this is like almost the top of the research tree in terms of validity. And it's got some interesting things there about some specific strains for probiotics. The third paper I want to talk about is around skin health and IBS. And is there a link between people who have IBS and conditions like rosacea, psoriasis, acne? So if you have issues with your skin, you might be interested in that one. Each one, I'm going to go over a little summary of what the paper showed and then something that might be useful for you, either for giving you a little bit of confidence, information, clarification, or something actionable that you might want to put into practice. We are going to start with SIBO, and the paper that I'm describing is called Hydrogen Sulphide and Methane on Breath Test Correlate with Human Small Intestinal Hydrogen Sulphide Producers and Methanogens. And it was published in 2025 in November, and I will link to it in the show notes. Part of the reason for introducing this paper and talking about it is there is some concern, I think, among gastroenterologists that SIBO is not a real condition or that SIBO breath tests do not correlate with actual disease that can be found. And this paper really shows that there is a link between breath levels and microbes in the gut, because what they did is they wanted to prove that the gut microbiome, that the bacteria were there in the gut, were making these gases. Now, this had only been done before for hydrogen. What we've got here is hydrogen sulfide and methane producing microbes showing up. Now, the way that they did this, they got 110 people who all had positive breath tests. It was in America, so they can test on the Trio Smart test hydrogen sulfide, which we can't really do in the UK, partly because I think hydrogen sulfide degrades quite quickly, and so you can't post it off and get the files done remotely, either from home or in a hospital. So it has to be done in the lab, like right where you take the test, and that's what makes it so difficult to diagnose. But in this test, they had, out of 110 people, 20% had high methane overgrowth, and some of them also had hydrogen sulfide. Now, we don't have a positive, cutoff point, really, for what is positive in terms of hydrogen sulfide, but they were looking at anywhere between 0.31 parts per million and 3.5. So any kind of production of hydrogen sulfide. People who had positive breath tests also had an endoscopy, a small bowel aspirate, where they go down your throat into the top of the small intestine and take a small portion of the liquid just to look at what kind of bacteria were there. Now, what was interesting is that they noticed certain microbial signatures related to people who had positive breath tests. That's what's interesting, that there are some particular bacteria that we know produce hydrogen sulfide that is also correlating to a high breath test. Now, what it also showed is that people who had higher hydrogen sulfide gas also had a lot looser stools. So again, it's linking it back to the symptoms. Now, this is important because sometimes people will say, Oh, well, there is an element to having some hydrogen sulfide production that's natural. Like our body should be producing some hydrogen sulfide. Sulfide production is a normal part of human physiology. But when we link it to the symptoms, and higher levels have worse symptoms, and we can also see that higher levels of these particular bacteria also correlated with higher breath tests, then we're starting to get a picture that is really evidencing that an dysbiosis in the small intestine could be leading to symptoms which are very often considered IBS. And unless we know that it is SIBO, it's very hard to resolve it because the bacteria do not go away on their own. The study also looked at methane, as I mentioned, and what they also show is similar to the hydrogen sulfide. They found that methane in the small intestine correlates to methane producing microbes in the small intestine, and we shouldn't have a massive overgrowth of methane in the small intestine. This correlated with worse constipation. So the higher the level of methane on the breath test, the worse the constipation severity, and this is something that we see quite often in practice. So those things linked up, similar results. If you've got high gas levels, then you've probably got small intestine bacterial dysbiosis or overgrowth, and this correlates to symptoms. So the more you have, often the worse the symptoms are. The reason for saying this is that in late 2025, a European consensus on SIBO testing from a lot of gastroenterologists across Europe came out and said that they didn't think SIBO testing was relevant. And this paper just shows that in some ways, we have got more evidence that's growing that there is a connection between bacterial levels in the gut, breath testing, and symptoms. And this is what I wanted to make clear. So you may have seen people posting online saying SIBO tests are irrelevant, it's not helpful. And actually the European Society of Gastroenterology have said SIBO testing is a waste of time. Now, this might very well be because some tests are not properly validated. So a lot of tests that you get on the market don't have the right seals on the files that you might send off, depending on how they calibrate their machines. Like, there are cheaper ways of doing it that don't always produce results. And people don't always do the prep diets properly. They don't always follow the preparation for the test, that kind of thing. So there are lots of reasons why SIBO testing isn't effective and might not work. But I think when we see it in a research setting, what we can see is that we're starting to get more evidence that it is a real condition. And I think I just wanted to highlight that. All right, that's enough on that one today. Second paper that I want to talk about today is titled Efficacy of Specific Probiotic Strains in Subtypes of Irritable Bowel Syndrome, Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis of Randomized Controlled Trials. It combines results from around 16 randomized controlled trials. So randomized controlled trials are really good quality evidence. Normally, when we're looking for papers that are well tested, don't have too much bias. So we're looking for things where people have either a very good placebo that's being controlled against, that they are randomized into it, not so that the researchers have put people who they think will respond into certain groups, like a lot of restrictions and controls around how they set those kind of studies up. And it also has quite a big group of people, so 2,800 adults. So it's quite a lot of people who have IBS. When all these studies were pulled together, we could have a look at. So what they covered is not just are probiotics good for IBS, but they looked at which types of IBS respond to which types of microbes. And there are studies out there that do this, but they've consolidated the results, and it's quite helpful. Now, a little plug, I do actually have this kind of information in my book, which is called Inside Knowledge for People with IBS and SIBO, which will take you through constipation. These are the best well-tested strains. Diarrhea, these are the ones that help, and these are the studies that prove it. So I've got examples of what the studies have shown and how you can apply that. So there's a little plug. If you haven't yet got my book, you can download it on Amazon, wherever you are in the world, and it's called Inside Knowledge for People with IBS and SIBO. Now, back to the study, which actually came out after I had submitted my book. So this is not included in my book because this study was in December 2025. Interestingly, they found overall probiotics helped people with IBS. There was a positive outcome to the results. The thing that was quite interesting in this study is that the multi-strain probiotics seem to come out better than single strain. And so what we know, and what I've always, tried to promote, is that each individual strain of probiotic is tested for different reasons. And therefore, we need to use the probiotics if we're trying to target gut symptoms that have been tested for the result that you want. Some are better for people with IBS-C, constipation, slow transit time. Some are better for people with high sensitivity and fast transit time because they work in different ways. Now, what this study seemed to show is that the multi-strain probiotic combinations actually had a better result than some of the single strains, but it depends on the people as well. So what we don't know is what was their gut like before they took these. Maybe they had extremely low diversity, and actually adding in a sprinkling of lots of different bacteria made a more significant impact on their symptoms than a single strain probiotic would have. So they showed that with constipation, yes, the multi-strain formulas that had a combination of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium were maybe more effective for people who had a lot of bloating, pain, and it just improved their satisfaction with their bowel habits. Then particularly for IBS-D, there were a couple of strains that this study pulled out. One called Lactobacillus plantarum and Lactobacillus gasseri. So these helped with the severity of the diarrhea, the abdominal pain, the stool consistency, and just improved their quality of life and how people felt about their digestion. But overall, what I think is helpful for this study is also thinking that some of those multi-strain combination products can be of value. And it's interesting to think about why that might be the case. It may be because you have low diversity, adding in a sprinkling of different types of probiotics could be just the thing that you need. So they also acknowledge in this study that this was a second line approach. So these people had already tried improvements to their diet, their lifestyle, their eating habits. So it kind of challenges some of the worry that probiotics don't work and we never need probiotics, but it also reinforces the case that this isn't the first thing that we should go to. The first thing that you should change is how you're eating, looking at trying to get a good, healthy, balanced diet, making sure that you're having some time for rest, you're exercising. These are all still really important. But probiotics, if you've done all of those things, could be an effective way to try and support your gut by adding in good, healthy, live bacteria. Right, let's move on to the third paper that I wanted to bring up today. This is called Directional Association Between Irritable Bowel Syndrome and Dermatological Disease, a large-scale retrospective study. Retrospective studies are when the study group, the people who are doing the research, they look backwards. So rather than thinking, we're going to study what happens if we change X, Y, Z in someone's diet and see what happens, and then that is giving you evidence. This is when they're saying, right, we're going to look backwards. We've got a lot of data in a certain cohort of people. Maybe they're people who've attended hospital due to their IBS. And they look at how many of those people also had skin conditions. This study also looked at people who had skin conditions and then how many of them were also treated for IBS or also saw a doctor for gut health conditions. So it was a two-way study, which I like because it's looking at what's the most common associations between them. Now, this study is not saying IBS causes skin conditions or skin conditions cause IBS, but that sometimes they overlap. And if you're suffering with issues with your skin, it might be interesting to realize how common it is. We know that there is a skin, gut, brain microbiome kind of axis, that there's a connection between how we feel and how we think and our emotions, mental state, and the gut. And then there's also a sort of third arm to that triangle, which is the skin as well. The strongest relationships in this study that came out, it was for psoriasis, rosacea, and urticaria, which is chronic hives. Psoriasis is like a scaly red patchy kind of condition on your skin where people are getting a lot of turnover of the top layer of the skin, overproduction, and that creates the flaky feeling. And also it can be quite itchy and painful. Then rosacea is where people are getting a lot of redness on the cheeks. So often small capillaries that will be very visible and give you a lot of redness on the skin. And there is a known connection between rosacea and SIBO that has been tested in multiple research studies. So we already know that there was a big connection between that and urticaria as chronic hives. So we've got to think here about high levels of histamine and whether it is actually histamine intolerance or histamine overload rather than IBS, because what this study didn't do is identify some of these details about the gut. So because this study looked backwards, it wasn't able to interview the people. It wasn't able to ask them about their diet, about what else was going on for them at the time. We didn't know much about the severity of their symptoms either, just that they had IBS and they had rosacea, for example. So these kind of things are interesting. But again, I want to stress it's not saying that one is causing the other, but just that they may be grouped together. And this may be a role to think about the body as a whole, rather than just really only focusing in on one specific element of digestion, like gut microbes or like transit time or something like that. We need to go take a step back and look at the overall body. Some of the basics that I was talking about in the previous episode about the Gut Reset Cogs model that I use, go back to the basics and think about what can you do to improve your overall diet diversity if you are very restricted in your gut. Maybe you're not getting enough key nutrients that are really strongly supporting skin health. There may be connections between the gut and the immune system, which can then put cells in the skin on high alert. And this is particularly in psoriasis, where you can get immune activation in the gut, which may be triggering skin conditions, particularly for certain types of immune modulating cells called Th1. Now, these are cells which maybe put your body into high alert and overproduction, and there could be a role there. We also know that just there's ongoing systemic inflammation just from irritation in the gut. Now, what I don't want to do is to dive into inflammation. I did do a really in-depth episode about inflammation, which was episode 76, where I explained what the inflammation markers are in IBS and what you could be looking at. That is a good episode to go back to and revisit. But what I'm not saying is if you have IBS, your gut is inflamed, therefore it's causing the skin, because that is not what this study's showing. But what we can say is that there potentially is a link between some of the things we're doing to manage IBS that could potentially be a trigger. So not eating a broad enough diet, maybe triggering immune responses in the gut. And also, like I mentioned before, we know that there is a link between rosacea and SIBO, although this study did not pull that link out. And then in terms of urticaria, if you're getting a lot of mast cell activation, if you're getting hives all over your body and a lot of itching, then potentially thinking about histamine and the gut. And another little plug for my book, if I can, I have got a whole chapter on how to manage histamine intolerance or histamine overload with examples of what you can eat for a low histamine diet. So do check that out for more details if you want a bit more support on that. I think I might do a podcast episode on histamine coming up, though, because I haven't covered that in much detail. So to finish off this episode, just really thinking about what research information can show us and where we should look for, clinically relevant information that you can trust. This is getting increasingly hard to do on social media, because there's just a lot of nonsense on there about what people are saying you should be doing, you should be following. There are thousands of papers that are produced each year, and some of them aren't going to change the course of action. But I just thought these were maybe interesting to pull out for the start of 2026. That's the end of this episode. I will be back next week with another episode So please tune in again. And if you're able to rank or rate my podcast, I would really appreciate it if you will give me a review on whatever platform you're listening to. Just say that you found it useful. Maybe leave a comment. You can on Spotify, or you can just give it a rating in the app. Thank you very much. Okay, let's leave it there for this week. Thanks very much for listening to this episode of the Inside Knowledge podcast. Better digestion for everyone.